You guys ready?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's a very anticlimactic beginning because there is no like real beginning. It's just we started. That's it.
Action.
Well, you'll be in charge of the video and sound effects, Suzanne. Okay.
Done.
Done. All right. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the School of Innovation podcast. It's a great pleasure and honor to have the one and only Scott Anthony with us today, talking about, yes, virtual clapping, talking about his new book, Eat Sleep Innovate. Hey, Scott, welcome.
Hey, Neve, great to be on here. Suzanne, nice to see you over the Zoom as well. Good morning and good afternoon.
Awesome. So we'll get started right away. Can you just give like a quick intro for the folks who don't know who you are and what you do at Innosight?
Yep, so the basic background, so I'm Scott Anthony. I'm a senior partner at Innosight. Innosight is a growth strategy consulting organization. It was founded back in 2000 by my colleague Mark Johnson and the late great Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. And our mission over the course of the past 21 years has been to empower forward-thinking organizations to navigate disruptive change and own the future. I joined the organization in 2003 to 2010. I helped build up our North American operations. 2010, I moved out to Singapore, where I've been based ever since, trying to help large organizations confront the challenges of disruptive change.
Nice. Okay. And how are things going now with, or I don't know where we are on the COVID, right, on the trajectory in general, but how's it going? Like what are you feeling for your clients? What's the...
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and who knows where exactly we are. Only in hindsight will we be able to really say where we were in things. Trying to make predictions in the moment is a very hard thing to do. But the thing that we have very clearly observed in the environment is people are generally looking forwards as opposed to backwards. And exactly how things are going to unfold in the weeks, months, and quarters ahead, nobody knows. But I think more and more of the organizations we're working with are saying, okay, the pandemic really caused us to step back and ask some pretty fundamental questions about our business, and we need to answer those questions. And of course, different organizations are in different places. Some people are kind of on the letter shape K. Some people zoomed up during the pandemic. They're now saying, what do we do with this pandemic premium that we got? Other people, unfortunately, were grounded during the pandemic. And the question is business going to come back? And if not, what are we going to have to do differently? But this issue of innovation, growth, renewal, transformation, it used to be something that was in a pocket of the global economy, and now we really see it everywhere. No big surprise.
Yeah. So you could say sort of business as usual, I guess.
So yeah, and people will say business is unusual, going to the whatever new abnormal, the new whatever. But I think generally, the thing that we've learned over the course of the past 12 or 13 years, the global economy is pretty darn resilient. It didn't die in April and May of last year, and it could have. I mean, there are worlds where supply chains freezed up and all that. So this isn't going to kill us. Not a great thing. Obviously, we have a lot of work still to do to go through it. But people are now saying, what do we do next? And of course, one thing I personally learned just from having the personal opportunity to do an above average amount of international travel through the pandemic. I've done now 4 global trips since the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. All pandemics, while they're global in nature, they show up in very local ways. So the experience I'm having here in Singapore is different than the experience in Sydney, is different than the experience in Israel, is different than the experience in Sao Paulo, is different than the experience in different parts of the US. And while we have some shared language for this, we don't really understand it fully because people aren't going to as many different places. So I think even though we are having a communally shared pandemic experience, it's actually really different in different places, which is an interesting thing to reflect on probably at a different time.
Yeah, for sure. Suzanne, you wanted to say something?
Yes, well, something that I picked up from your initial answer is also that innovation is something that is now touching many more lives than it was before, where what I've personally experienced was initially was just a smaller group of people that were doing stuff with creating new kinds of value now is really something everywhere that's everybody's responsibility, which I thought would be a nice bridge to Eat Sleep Innovate, as what I've been seeing is the need to innovate across horizontally, vertically has just gotten so much bigger.
Yeah,
and I would 100% agree with that. And you know, we've seen that horizontal and vertical is an interesting way to describe it, because we've seen more industries and sectors showing up with innovation related questions, and also more functions. People saying, what do we do to make supply chain more resilient, more efficient, more effective, more ready to operate in today's world? And enter whatever function you want to put in. How do we make HR future ready? What's the future of work look like? Just lots of good, juicy innovation questions that are being asked everywhere, just about everyone now.
Yeah, and how you're putting it, it also goes beyond just customer focused innovation, like the external end user of whatever product that we're creating, but also how you're describing more internally focused functions that are also thinking of how can we be better? How can we create more value to potentially our internal customers?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things we try to do in the book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, we try to be as clear as we possibly can on definitions. So we have a definition of innovation, which is something different that creates value. And it's pretty simple, but there are two really important phrases in it. Something different is intentionally vague. It gives space for big things like world-saving vaccines. It gives space for day-to-day things as well. And the purposeful vagueness of it reminds us that innovation is not the job of the few, it's the responsibility of the many. Then creates value reminds us that innovation is different than invention and creativity. It's the application of it. Because until we have gone and boosted revenues, improved engagement, had closer relationships with suppliers, made our supply chain more efficient, or whatever problem we're trying to solve, in our eyes, you have not innovated. And we remind people of the old Edison quote, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So innovators have to sweat it out.
Yeah, for sure. So let's backtrack a bit and start with like, what's the origin story of the book? Like, why did you decide to write the book? Why do we need another innovation book, essentially?
It's a great question. So, you know, the origin story, there's kind of a two-part answer to this. I remember the first time we started thinking about it in earnest was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. You know, so we're founded by Clayton Christensen, the father of disruptive innovation. Most of our work focused on disruptive innovation. How do you spot it? How do you seize the opportunity, deflect the threat, and so on? And you know what the answer is. You know, you're going to set up a special purpose group. It's going to do the things it's going to do, et cetera. And I remember we were having a session with a great big company that is headquartered not in Singapore, but we're running the session in Singapore, a big shipping and logistics company. And we're going through our stuff, and the CEO gets pretty impatient pretty quickly. And he says, yes. I've read all your books. I understand everything I'm supposed to do. We've done all of that. I've got like 75,000 other employees. What do I do with the rest of them? And we didn't actually have a really good answer to that. So that's one part of it. The second part is just trying to address something that has grown increasingly puzzling to me as life has advanced, because in parallel to advising large organizations all around the globe, I, along with my wife, have been raising 4 children. Oldest is now 15, the youngest is 4. And the mystery to me is the thing that we tell our clients to do when it comes to innovation is just so natural and easy for the kids. So I don't have to teach my kids to experiment and be curious and be adaptable and try new things, because they're kids. That's what kids do. So one of the reasons we wrote the book is to try to address the mystery. Why is it that innovation is a natural act when we're born and a very unnatural act when we're grown up inside large organizations? So those are the two origin stories. I sometimes will use one or the other depending on context. You got them both.
We're very lucky. So that reminds me kind of a Zig Ziglar quote. When someone asked him, like the motivational speaker, someone asked him, does motivation stick? Like after you teach someone how to be motivated, does it stick? And he said something like, neither does showering, but that's why we recommend it every day. So, right, it's kind of like you got to build the habits, right? To build the habits for innovation in order for the thing to stick. And I thought that there was a really strong thread about that in the book, and we'll touch on that in a bit. Okay, so the argument is we want to uncomplicate innovation, make it as simple as possible for folks to follow. Let's talk about some of the definitions or the foundations that you set up in the book. The first one you kind of alluded to, which was what is innovation, and you gave a very simple, kind of straightforward definition. The other one is culture, and that's sort of that's not as easy as it feels to me, like talking about, like everyone talks about culture. How do you talk about culture? Like, how do you define it?
Yeah, so we channel Edgar Schein when we talk about culture, and Schein basically talks about 3 levels of culture. The things that you see, which Schein calls artifacts. They're the ways in which people work, the day-to-day habits of the organization. Then there's the most critical thing, which are the underlying beliefs, the things that form the bedrock assumptions that lead to people doing certain things that produces certain visible results. And I'm using my hands to show different levels because we use the metaphor of the iceberg, as many people do, where you see the artifacts, but that's the proverbial tip of the iceberg. As you go deeper beneath the waterline, you see the stuff that really matters, which is the underlying assumptions and beliefs. Now, what we do in the book is we say, if you're really going to change culture, the place where you want to focus is actually at the waterline. You change an artifact, you change what you see, that doesn't have much impact. Trying to change beliefs is actually a really hard thing to do. We have the Richard Pascal line. It's easier to get people to act their ways into new ways of thinking than to think their ways into new ways of acting. So we say, if you can get people, just as you mentioned before, the idea of showering, if you can get people to habitually follow the behaviors that drive innovation success to the point where they stop being conscious about doing it, it ultimately seeps into the fabric of the organization. It becomes one of those bedrock assumptions. So that's the way that we think about culture, and it also informs some of the way that we go through the material in the book.
I feel that was a bit complicated for me. I feel like we need an example. Can we have like a story or an example of how that sort of works? So I'm thinking, okay, I walk into a room of a bunch of executives, and I'm supposed to like make a change in the culture of the organization. It kind of goes back to like what you were saying in the beginning. Everyone knows that culture is important. Like, how do we really, maybe from the book, how do we really change culture beyond the definition? Like, do we have a...
Yeah. And I think it's really important what you just said. Culture is not simple. Defining it is not simple. Identifying it is not simple at a really, really foundational level. As you will often, when you talk to people, you'll get stuff that they wish were true that actually is not. There was a great article in the Slow Management Review a few months ago by Charles Sull and Don Sull that basically looked at what organizations' stated values were. You know, what were the things that they put on their website? Like, these are the foundational values of our organization. And what were the actual behaviors that people were following, as evidenced by what people were citing on Glassdoor reviews, what they were writing in 360 reviews, and so on. And the Sulls found that there is basically zero relationship between stated values and actual behaviors. So really, truly understanding the culture of a group, of a team, of a department, of an organization, it actually is a legitimately exceedingly complicated thing. The good news is you don't have to worry too much about that to use the ideas in the book, because we do make it simple. We do say, if what you're trying to do is have a culture of innovation, we define that as one in which the behaviors that drive innovation success come naturally. So we say it's one where an organization does 5 things. They're curious, they're customer obsessed, they're collaborative, they're adept in ambiguity, and they're empowered. So we argue that those 5 behaviors allow innovators to succeed. You do those habitually, you have a culture of innovation. And then the rest of the book, once we define it, says, okay, how do you understand what stops you from doing that today? And what kind of intervention then can encourage those habits to happen without you having to force or cajole or beat people into actually doing them? They're things that people do without consciously thinking about them, which is the definition of a habit. So again, there's a lot that's packed into that we can go deeper in, but I think that's kind of the connection between this often fuzzy concept of culture and the specificity of innovation and the behaviors that drive it, and why we focus again at that waterline. Culture isn't what you see. Culture is what people actually do on a day-to-day basis.
observing the behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Does it have to be across the organization, or should it like focus on specific parts initially and then sort of spread out, or does it play out like in different ways in hierarchies? Like, do you want the culture to start at the top and like, sort of trickle down to the bottom, or the other way around? What has been sort of your experience with that, or how would you, I guess, recommend that people approach that?
Again, a great question. So I think there's a couple things to say in response. One, it's very rare that an organization has a monolithic culture. That is, everywhere you go, you see the exact same thing. You're going to see for any organization of any scale, subcultures. It might be different departments have different cultures. It might be different offices have different cultures. It might be that people who've been at the organization for different lengths of time, whatever. So you are going to see lots of pocket subcultures and so on. And you really can start anywhere. So we have an example in the book. We talk about DBS Bank in Singapore, where it really is end-to-end, top to bottom culture change driven by senior leadership. We have another example in Singapore where we talk about Singtel, where it's really focused on a department and the HR department, and it's focused first on about 30 different change leaders. So, you have very clear contrast, even in the little environment of Singapore, between one organization that went comprehensive and one organization that went a bit more surgical. And really, you can work at any level. It's one of the things that I really like about the tools in the book. You don't have to be a CEO to use them. I mean, you can use them on yourself, on your team, on your group, on your department, whatever, because they're basically, again, about how do you get people, or how do you encourage people to follow these basic behaviors that drive innovation success. And those behaviors are useful no matter where you are in an organization, we would argue.
Yeah, I really like that in the book as well. So at some point you have the table where you have the different behaviors, and also then examples of very specific behaviors and what it looked like. And when I was going through it, I actually found myself checking like, hey, how often do I ask these types of questions? How often do I see leadership asking these types of questions? So it was instantly this moment of self-checking of how many of these behaviors do I actually already see around me. And from that, little bit of a first assessment on how are we doing within this team or within the wider organization. I really thought it was really cool how that was broken down into very specific things that you can see around you that reflect ultimately a deeper culture.
And I think, Suzanne, you highlight a general point. One of the things that I think inhibits people when they're trying to change culture of any kind, whether you want a culture of innovation, customer centricity, whatever, I think people just don't get specific enough. So they say we need a culture where people are collaborative. Okay, great. What exactly does that mean? What exactly are you going to do on a day-to-day basis that's going to evidence that you're being more collaborative? And if you can't define it, you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So I think the more specific you can be, whether it's about innovation or anything else, I think the better it is for culture identification and change.
So absolutely. So, because when I was going through this, I was like, "Ooh, these are things I can actually measure in a meeting. I can measure in a meeting how often are we saying, oh, but we have always done it this way," versus questions around how might we, or like what if kind of questions. If you would just like turf those and just count, okay, we have this many questions around this and this many questions around these themes within a senior management meeting, you could even check, all right, so at the end of the day, this is an indicator of the type of questions that are being asked, which reflect a broader culture shift potentially.
That's an interesting question there. So how did you, thinking about these, the things that you put into the book, right? You sort of on the face of it have kind of conflicting or contradicting agendas. One is you want to keep the book as simple as possible in order to make innovation a habit, a ritual, so people can follow it. But on the other hand, you want to give enough specificity, right, in order for people to actually be able to act like, okay, we have to do a culture change, but then now what? How did you, as you were writing the book, how did you balance these two things? Like,
well, as carefully as we could as a writing team. But, it is one of the tensions that you always face when you're putting anything together. It's having it be accessible and having it be right, or having it be true, and having it be useful. And the thing that I'm always conscious of is, something like we have this, one little thing about ethnographic research in a couple of places. Actually doing ethnographic research well, I mean, that's a skill. It takes practice, it takes training. It's something that there is a difference between people who are good at it and people who are not good at it. And we don't go into any of that in the book. That's not the intent of the book. But what you want to do is at least say, okay, if this is something you really want to get world class at, here's the point of departure. You understand you need to do it. There's a whole literature out there that you can go and study if you want to get better at these individual things. The way one of my friends describes it, he says, basically, you want to give people the next rung in the ladder. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to tell them, oh, this is all really easy. Don't worry about it. When it's actually hard, you want to say, okay, actually doing this at scale is incredibly difficult. Let me make the entry point as simple as it can be and tell you the next rung in the ladder is there. And if you really want to go and study it and get to mastery in any of these areas, these are the places you go and look at. You also know that the world is just scarce on time. That's just the way that things work, and attention span. And if you don't make it simple, you're going to lose most people really quickly. But I don't have a better answer than that. It is a constant tension in anything that I've ever put together. How do you balance being helpful and being comprehensive? And ideally you do both, but that's not always an easy thing to do in the constraints and pages and written words and all that.
No, that's a perfect answer. I really liked it.
Love it. It's a balance between waterfall style versus agile, right? Like, how do you make sure that at the right time the relevant information is there so you can progress just that increment that you need to progress for versus having the whole list of milestones written down already, which can potentially completely overwhelm and halfway through turn out not to be true.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience. I was just wondering if we could take a quick break. Not sure I understand the question, so this would be a good opportunity to also ask for clarification. Because Ronaldo asks, hey Scott, does your book specifically address the concern of tech-based or innovation-centric entrepreneurship that 0 to 1 have generally discussed? So there's a reference to the Peter Thiel book.
So I could interpret that question at least two ways, and probably more than that. One would be, does innovation only count if it's 0 to 1? So you're creating something that didn't exist before. That's one interpretation. Another would be that the whole Peter Thiel, his idea is that the goal of a technologist is to create a monopoly. That is the ultimate end goal, because you can extract rents and all that. And what does one think about it? Those are, and I'm sure there's other ways to interpret the question. And I will say the very short answer is the first one. We give lots of room for things that are big, like 0 to 1 market creating things, and things that are everyday improvements. And I think it's important to remember that both count. And of course, not everything is intended to go and create a company platform, whatever. There's lots of stuff that you need to do in order to have businesses continue to improve and fight against competitors and so on. The second, what do we do from a kind of socio-political perspective about the pursuit of monopolistic profits? That's beyond the scope of the book. A very topic, but not something that we talk about in the book.
That's for sure. Also, Ronaldo, if you could sort of clarify what you mean by like tech-based or innovation-centric. I don't think those are two opposing things, and the book doesn't specifically talk about tech-based innovation. Right.
In fact, fairly consciously not. We do try in the book we say, of course, there are examples from you name the company of the day, but we have a special focus on what we call no-debts, normal organizations doing extraordinary things. So there are case studies from organizations like UNICEF or from the Settlement Music School in the East Coast of the United States, not-for-profits. The Salvation Army is another example in the book. And one of the reasons we include these is to remind people that it's not just the Peter Thiels of the world that have license to innovate. It can be done in lots of different places. It should be done in lots of different places.
Awesome.
It's what I also really liked about how you defined innovation, right? It didn't have the word technology in it. There's just this something that create value, and technology, from my point of view, is just this enabler to make that happen, rather than what you need for something to be innovation.
if you talk to Clay about life regrets, Clay Christensen, one of his life regrets is that his first article, 1995 article in the Harvard Business Review, was called "Disruptive Technology: Catching the Wave." It was the use of the word technology that he didn't like, because he then got pinned as a technologist, and that's not what Clay was at all. He said the essence of disruption isn't the technology, it's the business model. It's the way in which value is created, captured, and delivered. People got confused by the use of the word technology. The technology is pretty trivial in most cases. The reason why Tesla is so hard for the OEMs to respond to isn't because of the technological excellence that Tesla has. It's because Elon Musk is following an incredibly different business model, going direct to consumer, over the air upgrades, and so on. That's the hard part. It's not the technology. I mean, technology, of course, has some issues as well, but the business model really is the heart of disruptive innovation. And the use of something there is a small homage to that point of reminding people it goes well beyond the technology.
Nice. Feel free to share more stories about Clay. He's, always with us in spirit, kind of the spiritual father of, I guess, everyone on this call, I guess, and folks in the innovation space. I want to go back to some of the things that you talked about in terms of making it easy for people to get into the habit of innovation. And this is a place where I've been thinking a lot about sort of the intersection between psychology, or the psychology of innovation, right? And I typically tell people like innovation is 1% technology, 99% psychology, going back to the Elon Musk reference. You talk a lot about that in the book in terms of hacking habits, and you've got this cool concept called beans. What's a bean?
Well, we are believers in the Picasso line, good artists copy, great artists steal. So a bean would be a great example of intellectual theft, where we basically say, okay, there's a great literature about behavioral psychology, habit change, and so on. It's mostly been focused on individual habit change. Let's pick that up and apply it to the corporate context. If we get to the essence of the problem the book exists to solve, I said part 2 of the origin story, kids are innovative, organizations are not. On the one hand, it's actually not that hard a puzzle to untangle, because organizations exist to do what they are currently doing more effectively and more efficiently. Innovation is something different. So kind of by definition, organizations struggle with it. So the question is, how do you go and fight against the inertia that will pull you back? Almost an addiction, we call it in the book, to business as usual. Habit change literature, that's your answer. So the BEAN tool that you mentioned, a BEAN is an acronym. It stands for a behavior enabler, artifact, and nudge. It basically says, if you're going to fight the habit change battle, you fight it on 2 fronts simultaneously. The behavior enabler goes after Daniel Kahneman's system 2, the logical, rational decision-making mechanisms, where you've got checklists and rules and coaches and all that to help people do something different. Artifacts and nudges go after the unconscious, where we're making decisions without thinking about it, system 1 level thinking. This is the visual reminder on the wall. This is drawing on gamification principles that motivate you to do different things without you even thinking about it. So that's the idea of a bean: behavior enabler, artifact, and nudge, direct, indirect at the same time, to try to overcome that inertia and encourage the behaviors that drive innovation success. And we've got 101 of them in the book. I will not go through all 101, but I'd be happy to go through a couple just to make the concept a bit more tangible, if that would be helpful. Or if you had 1 or 2 that you thought were your favorite, we'd love to hear that as well.
So I'm going to repeat what BEAN stands for, the acronym. We love acronyms, by the way. So BEAN stands for behavior enablers. So it's direct ways to encourage and enable behavior change. Then artifacts are the physical or digital objects to reinforce the behavior change. And the nudges are the indirect ways to encourage and enable the behavior change. Okay, cool. Give us a good BEAN.
There are, again, 101 in the book, but one of my favorite ones is the Adobe Kickbox, which is pretty well known by people in the innovation field, but maybe less well known outside of it. Yep. The idea is, how do you encourage people to simultaneously be more adept in ambiguity and empowered? You have, if you're a participant in the Kickbox program, you get this physical kit. And inside the kit, there are checklists and tools and guides about how you design experiments and rapidly prototype and all that good stuff. And there's also a prepaid debit card on it with 1,000 US dollars on it that you can spend without asking for anybody's approval. So you've got this beautiful combination where you've got these very clear ways to help people do different things. You've got the artifact of the box itself and some of the visuals around it. And you've got the nudge of that card sitting there with $1,000 on it. That's a very powerful
burning to be spent.
Talk about it. Exactly. Don't just talk about it. Go and actually do it. Fly a kite, build a prototype, whatever. Go and take your idea and make it real. So I think the Adobe Kickbox is a really nice one that brings the idea to life.
Yeah, agreed. So let's sort of try to visualize this. You are in a team, a corporate team, okay, and you go out and you get this this Kickbox. You get this beautiful Kickbox, and now you have the first sort of team meeting to talk about this new project, and you've got the box, and then you hit something that you call in the book the shadow strategy. What is the shadow strategy?
Yeah, this goes a little bit, we were talking about Clay Christensen before, it goes a little bit to the foundations of Clay's research. So if you want to say, who is the villain in the innovator's dilemma? The villain in the innovator's dilemma is the resource allocation process. It's an invisible, diffuse process that runs throughout organizations that basically allocate resources, whether that's time, money, scarce assets, whatever, between the different efforts inside the organization. The shadow strategy is essentially another way to describe the resource allocation process. Strategy isn't what a company says that it does. Strategy is what it actually does. It's the sum total of its commitments. It's how it's allocating its resources. So you might talk a lot about how our strategy is to innovate, transform, and do different things. But your strategy is what your engineers engineer, what your marketeers market, what your finance people fund, and on and on and on. Yeah. And the shadow strategy is all the day-to-day decisions that these people, these functions make, that left unchecked generally are to perpetuate the present, that left unchecked generally are to strangle the future. So if you are really to innovate and grow, you got to grab hold of that resource allocation process, shine a great big light on the shadow strategy, and make sure the way in which you're allocating your resources are consistent with what you're trying to do. It's a really easy thing to say, but it's an incredibly hard thing to do.
Okay. So the way I was interpreting that, and this is kind of interesting in terms of the ways that we look at the problem, the way you described it now is top down. So in the way that I was setting up the question, I was looking bottom up. So I want to know, how do I fight against this shadow strategy on the team level? Because what I'm visualizing is I've got this awesome Kickbox that I just got, and I'm really excited about this new project. And I meet with the team, but then I encounter a lot of this resistance to, right, all these new ideas, new things that I'm bringing to the table. Does that make sense? Like, is that one 100%. Facet? Okay.
100%. This is why it's so tricky. Is yes. Is it top down?
Okay.
It's yes. Because when you have that group of people together, you've got the finance function representative who's thinking in their head, my boss is never going to improve this because we're never going to have a spreadsheet that's going to look good. Or you have the engineering representative who says, this sounds like it's lower quality than what we've done before. That's not what we do. The way we do things is we make things higher quality, not lower quality. And then you've got the regulatory rep that says, this sounds like uncharted territory. How are we possibly going to do that? And they're all carrying with them, within their DNA, bits of that core organizational business model, which is impacting the way that they're looking at an individual idea. So what are you going to do if you're the team leader to try and combat this? Number one, be aware that it is there and give space to it and allow people to talk about it, bring it out in the open. And number two, really try to get people to be very conscious about the things that are laws of nature. The Newtonian physics say we can't do this, or business choices that we are making. And many times when people say we can't, of course they can. They're just choosing not to. And it is a huge difference when you're violating Newton's second law versus we've just decided as an organization we're not going to do this. You might not be able to violate Newton's second law. I did not study physics, so now that I said this, I realize I'm in trouble because I can't remember what actually the laws are. But whatever, we can't actually do much about that. But you can go and launch a pilot in a new market. You can go and try something. You can compete differently. You can have different pricing. You can have a spreadsheet that's filled with blank rows. There's no law that says you can't, no law of nature says that you can't do these things. So being aware of, giving space for, talking about, that's at least the beginning of a process to begin to defang this. But it's really hard. Again, I think one of the things I worry the most about in the book is we have made things simple, something different that creates value, 5 different behaviors. The idea of the bean, and you get people say, oh, that's not that hard. It's actually incredibly hard to actually do this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it also relates back to the behaviors that we're talking about earlier, right? And how you're describing it now and what I'm seeing with the teams that I work with, you know, they have their calendars are literally arranged around the shadow strategy. It's literally around updates on progress of this project, update on the credits review, update on this. So there's all these things that are literally taking up time, which is not being spent on innovation, but on the business as usual, but on the execution, but on the things that need to be delivered for today. So yeah, that is one of the main challenges that I see, is just the behavior that we have today is driven by the meetings that we have on our calendar, which are about delivering for tomorrow. And that's, yeah, then you can have all the structures in place that are just reinforcing this, the shadow strategy. We can need some very clear, strong, cool beans to break through that.
And Suzanne, there's a couple of reflections I have on what you described. I zoom back in time to a meeting that we had in 2005. We're a much smaller organization then, and we had this offsite, and we're talking about our strategic priorities, and we were filling out all these different flip charts with the things that we were going to do. And we had an outside observer in that meeting, Willie Shee, who used to be a top executive at Eastman Kodak, among other places, now teaches at the Harvard Business School in the class that Clay formed. And Willie just looked at the board. He said, who's actually working on these things? I mean, I see who's working at this organization sitting around the table. There are many more things on the board than there are people in the room. And we all kind of looked at each other, and nobody was working on most of these things. And Willie said something I've never forgotten. He says, where you spend your time is a reflection of your priorities. So if innovation really matters to you, if growth really matters to you, if the future really matters to you, and you're not spending any time on it, it doesn't actually matter to you. So that's one observation I have. And then the second reflection I had as you went through that, I think the thing that we are institutionally so bad at inside large organizations, we always forget that the most important word in the strategy lexicon has 2 letters in it. The first one is N, the second one is O. We're good at saying yes to things. We're really bad at saying no to things, disengaging, shutting down, removing ourselves from things, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And it's kind of worse with Zoom, because the obstacles have been removed. It's much less frictionless to say yes to everything. And it's an interesting segue about what you said, the Willie Shee story. Back, I think, to culture, to kind of wrap up the first part of the book. So the book has 2 parts. We're not going to talk about the second book, which has all the great goodies, the tips, the tricks, and the tools to do everything that you were kind enough to share with us. And we'll use that as a teaser for folks to go out and buy the book, because it's awesome. But to wrap up the first part and sort of close the discussion, we'll go back to culture. And again, this idea of observed behavior, okay? And you sort of outline a culture sprint, a 2-day, I think it's a 2-day culture sprint that you do at Innosight. And I was wondering if you can share more on that sprint. Sprint seems to be kind of a buzzword these days, thanks to Google and design sprints, and that's fine, that's great. What's your culture sprint like?
Yeah, we're not above riding on trends and buzzwords and all that, but the idea of the culture sprint, and in the chapter in the book, chapter 4, we provide as detailed a review of what we actually did as we could without violating any kind of client confidentiality. It was with the Singtel HR department. The idea is basically a six weeks of work highlighted by a 2-day, what we call activation session.
Right.
And what happens during the 6 weeks of work is you say, okay, let's be clear on what are the behaviors we're seeking to create in our context. Let's be clear about what are some of the, what we call behavioral blockers that are stopping us from following these behaviors. Let's be clear about what are some of our general opportunities, some of our general challenges. And then let's set up this 2-day experience to go and create a set of change agents. And in the 2-day experiences, day one, people live the desired behaviors. In the case of Singtel, we were using basically the 5 innovation behaviors I talked about before. So being curious, being customer obsessed, and so on. This was an HR community. So we had 36 HR reps actually go and work on real HR specific problems, like how do we create an awesome onboarding experience, or the group was just about to open up this new great gleaming training center. How do we make sure this is as great as it can be? So, we gave them real problems and we said, go and follow these 5 behaviors and see how you can come up with high impact ideas to go and approach these areas. The teams then did that and they realized that number one, these behaviors were not incredibly challenging. They were things that came reasonably natural to them. Number two, they were things that allowed them to have huge impact in a short period of time. And number three, they weren't things that came naturally to the organization today. So day two then was a beanstorm. The beanstorm, we're trying to come up with behavior enablers, artifacts, and nudges. We said, remember how great it was to follow those 5 behaviors on day one? Now let's talk about for each of those behaviors, what's stopping us from following it today, what behavior we're doing instead, and let's come up with a bean that can allow us to overcome that blocker to encourage that behavior. Then after the session, go and take some of those beans and actually use them to help to encourage the behaviors, to encourage a culture where those behaviors come naturally. And there were, the chapter described some real things that came that had big impact within Singtel, were relatively simple things. But like anything, like the shower metaphor you talked about before, simple things done every day really do add up. So one just basic example, Singtel said that the HR department should be more customer obsessed. That's being more employee focused. They said, well, one of the challenges we have is we always start meetings by saying, what's the proposal we're reviewing or what's the specific thing we're trying to do? We forget about the employee and the problem we're trying to solve. So they came up with this idea of a ritual called WITCH, W-I-T-C-H. Where is the customer here? What is their concern? What is their problem? And made sure that they always started meetings by asking those questions, just to ground them in the customer, in the employee, in the problem they're trying to solve. It seems pretty idiot simple, and it is, but like anything, something that's simple, that's done repeatedly can have real big lasting impact. So that's the idea of the culture sprint. You don't transform a culture by doing this. 2 days, 6 weeks isn't going to do it, but it's a great way to sharpen the focus and accelerate the journey.
I appreciate you for saying that. I was gonna call you out on that, but you said that, and I appreciate you. What happens in the following weeks, the next six weeks? Like, how do you track? I guess you're tracking, and also kind of making sure that they stick to the sort of the commitments that they've made to, right, in terms of these habits.
Correct. So then it's you loop, right? You say, okay. We had our day one design, which is these behaviors, these behavioral blockers, these beans. And then you say, okay, we've done this. What's worked, what hasn't worked? And one of the things that I think is important, and I think the DBS case in the book shows this really well, for everything you're trying to do, you want to have some kind of measure for it, even if it's a proxy measure. So one of the beans in the book is this ritual DBS has called Mojo. I won't go through all the details. You can read about it online. But the point was to make meetings more collaborative. They had a way they could measure it. They had an employee survey that showed at the beginning, 40% of people said meetings were collaborative. After the Mojo bean was adopted, that number went up to 80%. They also came up with a metric to say, how much time are we spending in meetings? You got to be rough when you come up with metrics like this, but they had it. And they were able to say, the more we use Mojo, the more efficient our meetings get, to the point where by the end of 2019, they said we've saved 500,000 hours in employee productivity by using this bean. So this idea of saying, can we measure things, even if they're proxies, is really powerful, because that way you can say, yes, it appears to be working or not. If it isn't working, you adjust it or you scrap it, and you keep cycling.
Perfect. Perfect. There's actually another question from Sachin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Cultural shift is imperative. However, at people level, creating a motivation is most critical for any organization to drive innovation. So creating the motivation. Could you please suggest top 5 motivational ideas to inspire people?
Yeah, I'm just going to do one. I'm going to do one.
Do one.
It's a very clear one. And we get versions of this question a lot. You know, how do you inspire? How do you incent? What's the reward you have to offer? Blah, 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 blah. In my mind, while it's not unimportant to think about those things, it's not the real problem. It's not the real barrier. The biggest barrier that we see in almost every organization are the punishments that get doled out if you take a well thought out risk that doesn't pan out. So to me, the number one thing that you can do is say cheers to intelligent failure. Cheers to intelligent failure. What does that mean? The cheers to failure is one of the beans in the book. This is from the Finnish gaming company Supercell. Whenever they're working on a game and they decide to shut it down midway through, they have a ritual. Everyone gets together, they pop open champagne, they say cheers to failure. So this idea of ritualistically celebrating failure is an important thing to remind people that well thought out risks are okay. I put the modifier intelligent in there because failure is actually not something that should be encouraged. Lots of failure is bad. Lots of failure is painful. Lots of failure should absolutely be punished. People who do stupid things, who don't do their homework, who take poorly thought out risks, etc. Go look at Amy Edmondson's work. She defines intelligent failure very clearly. That type of failure, and only that type of failure, is when you pop the champagne. And if you do that, if you say cheers to intelligent failure, in my mind, it has huge impact to unleash the latent innovation energy that's sitting inside an organization. I think people are human, that they love to create, they love to try. It's learned helplessness because they've learned that the penalties for trying and failing are so steep that they just say, why bother? And no amount of money, no amount of motivation will get them to overcome it because it's a very, to your point, Yaniv, it is a very psychological barrier.
Sachin wants to say something, I think. Do you want to add to that, to your question?
Yeah, I mean, hey, Scott and Susan and everyone, thank you so much for giving this opportunity to even to enter in the room. And thanks for the clarification, Scott, from the motivation perspective. And you are absolutely right. I think that's the way we can actually, release the psychological fear of people on the failures, which actually in turns motivate people towards the innovation. If we try that on the ground. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Go get a bottle of champagne.
Oh, yeah.
Or whatever is equivalent. I recognize that is not a culturally sensitive metaphor in all contexts. So whatever is the nice reward that can be given.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sachin, for the question. Suzanne, I see you're actually inside the shadow strategy as we speak now. Your background lighting has gone.
The sun has set here.
Yes.
So right now I'm just it's just the monitor lighting me up.
Awesome.
Because I was like, oh, should I set up like the proper light? But I was like, nah, this should carry me far enough. However, the sun has set and now it's pitch black outside. However, what I just wanted to add on what you were just sharing in terms of failure, intelligent failure, because what I've just been saying has been fail is an acronym for first attempt in learning, but you need to be really intentional about it, right? It's not just any kind of failure that's okay. And that's something I will really take forward as well and iterate with my teams, that it's not about just any failure is okay. Of course, you need to create the psychological safety that people feel safe to try new things on. However, let's be intentional about what we want to learn and then set out to do it. Whether you either win or you learn.
And Suzanne, I think that it hits to an important point. If you ask Amy Edmondson what drives her psychological safety, what drives her a little crazy, is people think psychological safety are places where people are all really nice and they give out lots of hugs and it's a soft environment. And that may not be the case at all. Like Netflix is a very psychologically safe environment. It's also pretty brutal. It is a performance-driven culture. One of the freedom and responsibility tenets at Netflix is adequate performance merits a generous severance package. I mean, does that sound like a touchy-feely sort of place? It's not at all. But it is a place where you can speak truth to power, where you can disagree with people, ideas trump some of the specific ranks, etc. But psychological safety does not necessarily mean people are giving lots of hugs and toasting lots of champagne. They can be tough environments too. But it's about having the space where you can constructively debate and disagree, where it's about the ideas and not about the people. And that is a huge
It's about the data.
Organizations.
It's about the evidence and the data, and not about the sensitivity in relationships, but really more around how do we collectively can get better by learning from this and not listening necessarily to the HIPPO, another acronym, the highest paid person's opinion in the room, and making sure that everybody stays nice and happy to each other. It won't necessarily move things forward.
Awesome. I posted a link to Amy's profile on Harvard Business School, at Harvard Business School. If people want to check it out, we'll also put that in the show notes. But before we wrap up, Scott, where can people get the book? Tell us where to get the book.
Yeah, well, it's available on Amazon.com and all sorts of other digital platforms. I know it's available, at least in Singapore, in good old-fashioned physical bookstores that still exist in some places.
Wow.
Are open in a few places as well. It is always one of the biggest kicks that one has when one has one's name on a book, when you actually go to a store, particularly with your kids, and you're able to point to it. My 4-year-old didn't quite comprehend what was going on, but I was very excited by it. And the book's companion website, eatsleepinnovate.com. We've got a whole bunch of free content there. So I mentioned that we've got 101 beans in the book. They're all downloadable from eatsleepinnovate.com. We've got diagnostic tools, and we've done some chats with some of the protagonists in the book that are accessible there as well. So, of course, we'd love people to get the books and really be able to get deep in the ideas, but we've got a bunch of other ways for people to access the materials in it.
Perfect. We'll add the link to that as well in the chat for folks who want to follow that and get the book. Sachin also said, yes, I purchased the book. I started reading. We'll be taking to reality soon. So thank you for that, Sachin, and for your question earlier. That's a wrap. Thank you so much, Scott, for being on the show today and sharing all these interesting ideas. And thank you for writing the book.
Thank you for having me. This has been a really good, really thoughtful, thought-provoking discussion. So I love doing these things because I always learn something from them, and I've learned a lot from this one. So thank you very much.